you can cherry pick all kinds of quotes from the church fathers and totally get it wrong. Like that, quote mining that you find, there's books that are just quotes of fathers supporting the papacy, right. But it's so misleading.
Where I find it kind of difficult to navigate as somebody who's inquiring, who's taking a look at history and stuff like that, is you do see a lot of language that may hint or suggest at certain ideas, right? Like the doctrine of papal infallibility. When you read certain writings, like let's say, for example, St. Maximus the Confessor, and he says something along the lines of like, he doesn't believe that the church or the Roman See can defect, or things like that. I'm not quoting verbatim, but things that seem to suggest that this type of language, and then having the councils affirm that same type of language as well. I think it's the Council of 787, the Council of Nicaea II. There's some indication that there's some, it might be praise, or it might be some type of indication that the church can never defect, and it will be undefiled until the end. So when you hear this, like as somebody looking at both sides, when you do just like a plain reading of certain texts, you're like, wow, I mean, this seems pretty strong. Like this language is strong. It's kind of hard to step away from that. Or even like that the Pope is the head of all the churches. You see that language and that pattern among the saints and the councils over time. Whereas, and I think this is like, for me, it makes it difficult when there are various ways of looking at certain things. Like you talk to some Orthodox and they might look at the role of St. Peter in the first millennium, or the idea of St. Peter, not St. Peter, the Roman pontiff. Some people might say like the papacy, it was merely honorific. Like there was no prerogatives granted to the papacy. And then you have other Orthodox to say, no, we affirm that he had a universal jurisdiction, but it wasn't immediate. It had to be in conjunction with the councils. And you have saints like Saint Simeon of Thessalonica, who agrees that certain things can be granted to the Pope insofar as he holds the Orthodox faith. So there's a contingency there. How do we square all of these like kind of different interpretations?
Well, first of all, so your approach to...
I kind of asked a lot of things.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. But let's go back to the first thing. So St. Maximus's, words, or any number of other saints' words about not just the papacy, but particular popes or other sees. There's tons of evidence in church history where this language, your understanding of this language will depend on a little bit about your mentality or your approach to if it's over rational or over logical or over literal. Whereas one of the strengths of the Greek language is hyperbole. The strength of the English language is understatement. It's two opposites. So if somebody who's grown up in the West and they're used to a very specific scientific approach to language and very kind of legalistic, and they come and they read the flowery poetic language of some of our saints or some of the councils, and they take everything as if it's literal and it's almost a legal implication, which is clearly not the case in the East. So that's what I was saying earlier. If you come to Orthodoxy or the Fathers, it really depends on whether you're going to examine them under the microscope that you've learned. In other words, your perspective and how it's been shaped. Another example that, just to try to get to the point, is that if somebody in the Protestant world raised in the English language, they're deeply impacted by Protestant theology, whether they like it or not, because that's what the language is, an expression of experience. Their experience is Protestantism. And ideas of grace and salvation have all seeped into the very language that people speak and the whole mentality of the society. That's how it is in Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy greatly shapes the Romanian people or the Greek people or the Georgian people, so that the Orthodox mentality permeates their culture and their language. Right. So very important to come in Orthodoxy and understand it on its own terms in its context. And I think this is where you can cherry pick all kinds of quotes from the church fathers and totally get it wrong. Like that, quote mining that you find, there's books that are just quotes of fathers supporting the papacy, right. But it's so misleading because they're not understanding it in this context, and they're understanding it as St. Maximus is not in those words. He's not a Vatican I apologist. I mean, it's absurd, right? He's clearly praising it for, in some ways, pastoral and practical reasons to support the faith against the monothelites at the time. And they're praising the steadfastness of Rome throughout the ages, absolutely. But as St. Simeon says, as you quoted St. Simeon, it's all predicated on the Orthodox faith. In fact, I would say more, it's predicated on the Orthodox experience. And if you go to the schism, which I'm sure we'll talk about, that one of the things that people don't commemorate is that is the background of the Roman See at the time in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. You've got to understand that in context. Why did they end up moving away in multiple ways from the East? Is it and asserting things that they had not asserted, or accepting things they had not accepted? Now, that's all in retrospect, blessed, as it were, because of the papacy in the West. But from the Orthodox perspective, we see a departure from a common experience. And I would point to there's a unity of ethos in dogma. And the minute you lose the one, you lose the other. And so behind the adoption of the filioque, for instance, is a loss of the common ascetic experience and common ethos with the East. It has to be that way. It's not, you don't have to listen to me and say, well, Father, what's he saying? That we lost, there weren't ascetics in the West? No, it's mathematical. If they depart in the dogma, they have departed also in the experience, because dogma is the fruit of our experience. So going back to what you're saying, those questions and that approach, if it's conditioned and if it's driven by a mentality that is already, let's say, predisposed to a vision of the church which is akin to, more agreeable in the West. If you go now and you approach the saints and the fathers and the statements, you're already at a disadvantage. You're already not going to get to the point. You're not going to go deeply into properly understanding their mind. So you've got to step back, and you've got to enter into the world and the ascetic life and the ethos of the fathers, and then view their statements about the papacy. Does that make sense?
So how do we properly view the role of the Pope in the first millennium? Because in some way, I guess that there's been an establishment of a pattern that there's at least some type of preeminence. It's just more so like, well, what is the preeminence look like?
First of all, it does not belong to the realm of theology. It belongs to the realm of economia. What does that mean? That the church gave whatever it gave. Now they later on they claim a divine right. They claim essentially as if it's an expression of revealed, and therefore it's in the realm of theology that the papacy is such. Vatican I certainly seems to imply that. The Orthodox Church understood the role of the papacy and every bishop in the realm of economy. In other words, the church in its life and in its journey imparted whatever and gave whatever was given to each bishop and the organization of the church. Rightfully so. In other words, we would definitely give to the papacy, the Orthodox papacy of the Pope of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, what was due to him, which was the first see, the first among equals, as we say in the Orthodox Church, and that he had this special role, which we see in certain canons, which talk about the relationship of the council or synod of bishops with the first, which is what they've discussed in the dialogue in the last 50 years. All of that is well known, and we accept that. And so the role of a Orthodox Pope would be very important, very authoritative, but not in a legalistic so much sense, but in a spiritual sense. That they carry with them the witness of a millennium of rightly dividing the word of truth. Many times during different ages. Of course, we had heretics in Rome in different times, but it was always predicated on the foundation which you see in the scriptures, which Peter confessed the faith. Peter was inspired because he had Christ, God, in him, right? It was the confession was not a external, legalistic, or moral thing. It was a deep spiritual insight that God gave him. He confessed the divinity, the divine humanity of Christ. That became the foundation of the church as a whole, not just the Church of Rome. And everyone who confesses that participates in follows Peter in that confession. And that's the foundation of the church, for the whole church. So it's not something that's only in the successors of the Pope of Rome. unique to the successors of the Pope of Rome. And without that, the successors of the Pope of Rome, the historical successors, lose all authority.